Welcome back, everybody. Cinema Around the World again. You know the drill. We watch 5 movies from a different country around the world, and then I rank them all. This week, the country is New Zealand. Out of 10, we've given New Zealand. Stay tuned to see how it ranks on our leaderboard. Let's start off with a little bit of context. New Zealand isn't a particularly big country, but the locations and landscapes themselves can be sweeping and huge. If you've ever traveled to New Zealand, you know it has some of the most picturesque locations in the world. Probably one of the most beautiful countries I've ever been to. And this is the main focus of the film scene in New Zealand today. It's the incentive to bring your production to New Zealand and use these incredible locations because it can be so versatile and so big and so vast. It can give a lot to a story. Although if we're going into it, it has kind of led to a current lull of stories that feel uniquely Kiwi. You go and you look at the top grossing films coming out of New Zealand. The last were made like 30 years ago, which really shows a shift in focus from the New Zealand film industry. They're kind of focusing on trying to advertise New Zealand, the location, trying to get big production companies to come make their movie there, right? Providing lucrative incentives for these production companies to film there, which is great for the economy, it's great for the industry there, but it does lead to a distinct lack of New Zealand movies. It makes sense because of the size of the country itself. There's not a big demographic there and the locations it has to offer. But, and this is probably the biggest point I'm going to raise, it does make you question whether there is even a cinematic identity in New Zealand. Now we're going to talk about the identity, so that might make this part a little bit hard, oopsie daisies, but let's keep plowing through anyway. Let's have a bit of fun with it. Look, I'm going to piggyback on what I said earlier for the sense of identity. The most cohesive thing I can say about these movies I watched today is that location played a pivotal role in the storytelling for every single one of the movies. The wide landscapes they use, there's so much more than just backgrounds for shots. They can almost serve as like characters in some of these movies, or at least are really thematically relevant. And I know this sounds like a broad sense of identity, right? And it is. I'm going to acknowledge that straight away. But really, it's the only thing cohesive about these stories that are just so different in style. They're so different in genre. And they're just got no visual language that makes them all fit together in a nice little box. But there is one other consistency I'd like to bring up, and that's in the Maori movies I watched. Once We're Warriors, Whale Rider, and Hunt for the Wilder People are all made by Maori filmmakers. And I found some common themes that were really interesting and I'd like to unpack a little bit. They all discuss the need to get back in touch with nature, this land that was once theirs, and the connection they have with it. I'll quickly talk more specifically about the first 2 movies I brought up, Once We're Warriors and Whale Rider, because I think they kind of attack these themes a bit more directly. They discuss the cultural disconnect between generations of Maori people. They talk about how their values clash with that of Western values, and they discuss how that's affected them as they've had to assimilate into Western culture. All these topics I'm going to talk a little bit more about in my specific reviews for these movies. But there is a distinct sense of identity just in the Maori films I watched. One other small thing I want to bring up, and I'm not sure if it's really a sense of identity as much as it's just a case I've seen fairly often in New Zealand cinema, is directors being a big fish in a small pond. 3 of the 5 films I watched are by some of the most critically acclaimed directors working in film today. Taika Waititi, Peter Jackson, and Jane Campion. All from New Zealand. That's pretty crazy for such a small film industry. But they all started by making New Zealand films before catering their films more to a global audience. Not really about Kiwi culture anymore after that. I think it's the fact that the market is just too small to be sustainable for such impressive directors who can make such big scale movies. So they always seem to want to broaden their horizons as soon as they possibly can. Even one of the films I watched, Power of the Dog by Jane Campion, is set in America. Although it's filmed by a Kiwi director, filmed in New Zealand, the story isn't Kiwi, which I think is a good example of the New Zealand cinematic landscape today. Hunt for the Wilder People, one of Taika Waititi's earlier movies when he was still making them in New Zealand about New Zealand. Last time I watched this film, I was a kid, and I absolutely loved it. I ate it up. And as an adult now, I can see why. At its heart, it's a kid's movie. Sure, it straddles the line between being for kids and being for an adult, but it is perfect entertainment for a child, which isn't to talk shit about it, because at heart, I feel like a lot of Taika Waititi's movies kind of feel like that. A lot of them feature a child as a lead who's thrown into otherwise adult situations and treated as such, with side characters who get increasingly slapstick and goofy. Hunt for the Wilder People follows a young foster kid and a lonely outcast who become fugitives on the run in the New Zealand forest. It never takes itself too seriously, yet does a few things really right, which I think elevate it above any old kids movie. For one, props where it's due, the score is absolutely phenomenal. It's these futuristic sounds that just make this adventure feel so big and so, I guess, otherworldly. It works perfectly with the locations they use and the vastness of the forests in New Zealand. It really makes it feel like a larger-than-life adventure. You also have to hand one thing to Waititi. He always knows how to write a really good emotional moment, a real good gut punch. Bang. Despite the overall wackiness of this movie that's constantly ensuing, he just has this nugget of gold, this emotional heart to all his movies, I feel, which keep you so engaged as an audience. It's this genuine connection that attaches you to the story so much more. It's also just really good writing. Plain and simple, the dialogue just flows super well, is really funny and witty. It always feels jovial yet emotionally impactful. But it's these same things that I'm giving a lot of plaudits that I feel can be the movie's downfall as well. Waititi does a great job of making you empathize for your leads and care for them so deeply, making them such lovable renegades. But as side characters, not so much. A lot of the time they are truly caricatures, like there's no other way about it. And the way they act, how exaggerated they are all the time, how unbelievable their motives are, I feel like can get a little grating. Which is why, once again, I'll say it's perfect for kids. Just a quick plug here. I will say his earlier film, Boy, is probably a better entry point to Waititi's films and to New Zealand films as a whole. It does everything this one does, but I feel like it's just elevated to a certain extent. Whale Rider is a really good Maori family drama, which studies the disconnect between generations and the associated positives and negatives of holding on to tradition versus progress. Particularly, it looks at how tradition can actually hamper progress, but also how progress can damage a culture. It's looked at through the lens of a little girl who was always kept at arm's length by her grandfather, who was the patriarch of the family. This was due to the fact that he always wanted a boy to carry on the long line of strong leaders in their family. And this resentment is the key driver for the whole movie, with some really powerful symbolism. It studies how a warrior survives in such a global, industrial, changing society, much like the other Maori movie I watched, Once Were Warriors, but maybe in a less in-your-face manner. It looks at how newer generations don't really have the maturity to take their own culture seriously, laughing at the haka, for example. Yet, the one young person, the young girl who does take it seriously, is shunned by her grandfather just because of her gender, despite the fact she's exactly what her grandfather is looking for. There's a lot to discuss about this movie, in all honesty, in terms of its themes and its story, because that's really where it thrives. But that being said, I do feel visually this movie kind of falls a little flat, unfortunately. It's really all there to play into the melodrama of the story, which I think really hampers the watching experience. These slow-mo shots, for example, really take you out of the moment and really sap it of the genuine emotion you should be feeling while you're watching it. And that's the same for the bombastic, over-the-top emotional score that's playing over every moment of genuine drama in the film. There isn't really anything of the cinematography that I found all that memorable, in all honesty, which really took away from a film that I feel otherwise would have lingered in my head a bit longer. But without some sort of well thought out visual language, it just kind of fell a bit flat. Still worth a watch for the story itself. It just had so much potential and could have been so much better with the visuals. Heavenly Creatures. This is Peter Jackson's second film before Lord of the Rings. He made movies before Lord of the Rings? What the hell? I thought watching this movie might be a little bit more relevant to try and get a picture of Kiwi cinema itself, as it's a true crime movie about a famous murder case in Christchurch, being set there rather than the fictional Mordor, I think. A little secret, I've never watched the Lord of the Rings movies either. Uh-oh. What would be the point in reviewing a movie everybody's already got an opinion on? It wouldn't be very interesting, so I thought I'd go here and try and get a more nuanced picture of Kiwi cinema. And spoiler alert, I didn't like it. This film has a distinctly 90s vibe about it, with a young Kate Winslet playing one of the leads. And it's really dramatized to a T. Like, it's so stylized for a true crime film, which always feels a little strange to me. Just check out these zooms. I don't know, they just feel a little tasteless. I don't know if that makes sense, but they do. And that's it. There's just something about this movie which I can't quite put my finger on, but just makes me feel a little, ugh. It's just a bit unlikable. And it's a very strange watch too. It's about two young girls who form a very distinct attraction and obsession with one another, and eventually conspire to kill one of their mothers as they try and tear them apart. It's the details themselves I find strange though. It's the inclusion of these magic surrealism moments. Might work very well in a fantasy movie. Cough cough, Mr. Jackson. But I found them super tonally confusing. And just plot-wise, I kind of had no idea what was going on at points. It lacked cohesion. The characters were just so exaggerated, and it made them, like I said before, really unlikable. And there was just nothing really relatable or nothing I could grapple onto in this movie. I'm glad things picked up for Mr. Jackson though, because I just didn't see the vision here. I mean, I'll end with this, all the way to the end of the film, where once again, somewhat tastelessly, He shows the actual murder happening, not the real murder, but like a dramatization of the murder. But he shows all the gory details of it, which just felt like a really strange move. I think just represents the whole unlikable sort of quality about this movie, whole atmosphere it had going. Now, I talked a little bit about it earlier, but I also watched Power of the Dog by Jane Campion. This movie is a slow burn. It drip feeds you information before you realize the bigger themes that are at play. Or maybe I'm just slow. It's hard to say. But the idea of taught repression, passed down from generation to generation behind this veil of masculinity, it's one that I find super interesting. The use of location too, as is a hallmark for all these Kiwi movies I've talked about, was obviously fantastic. I do feel though, the first half of this movie fell a little flat for me. Before they go out to the farm, which happens in the second half of the movie, I feel like the sets themselves, not necessarily the location, were just a little too clean for what's supposed to be a Western period piece. They did have a certain grit to them, but I don't know how to explain it. It just didn't feel true. It didn't feel real. It felt just a little too done up, and maybe I'm just a stickler, but it was just the vibe I was getting. It felt prepared and manicured rather than like genuine dirtiness, which I feel like would have felt a little more real. Take this for example, this hole in the window. It's used so often in the film, and it's like a perfect framing device to separate the kitchen of this building and the dining area. It didn't feel like it actually was part of the environment. And that's just a really small thing I picked up on, but I felt like in the first half of this movie, those sort of things were adding up a bit. The cinematography itself also felt super clean, rather than something a little grittier like I would have expected from a movie about this sort of period of time. But Kirsten Dunst, Benedict Cumberbatch, they were fantastic, obviously. It's a pretty damn good cast. And the way the boy of the story starts to villainize his mother as he grows closer to Benedict Cumberbatch's character is really brilliant. And he does this in favor of that father figure that he was always craving. One of the key pieces of symbolism of the film is about the location too. I won't spoil too much, but about seeing a dog in the hills is really fantastic. And I think it shows why it was filmed in New Zealand and how locations are kind of the heart of all these films. There were some really poetic moments like that. It's a movie that really gripped me towards the end and had some really poetic moments in the second half. So I think it might be better on a rewatch. Pick of the bunch today is a movie called Once Were Warriors, directed by Lee Tamahori. Quickly, I just want to say a trigger warning for this movie. There's some pretty intense themes of domestic violence and sexual assault being showed. Once Were Warriors is a really fantastic movie, and I want to give the least amount away as I possibly can in this review. I think it is the perfect movie to understand the struggle of the Maori people since colonization. Now, it has a super stylized, campy visual tone, with like electric guitar stings to like emphasize a camera being panned. Honestly, the dialogue might even feel a little unnatural at times, but I'd argue it's intentional. The dialogue in these conversations oftentimes pause and leave room for these really exaggerated camera movements. From the first act alone, it might even trick you into thinking it's like some sort of go-lucky, campy 80s movie. But you couldn't be more wrong with that assessment. Because as it starts to dive into some darker themes, and the rage, the anger, and the violence of these characters start to fuel the movie, it shows its true colors. The character of Jake, the patriarch of the family, is a violent, rage-fueled man. Alcohol makes him both the life of the party and truly despicable. Ultimately, and this is the heart of the film, it's a man who's lost touch with his roots. Where Maori men once were warriors, using rage and anger on the battlefield, he has no real place to put this now. He numbs his feelings with alcohol, where he in turn places this repressed rage onto his family. Now, I'm not going to say too much more about the movie. I know I haven't explained much plot-wise, but it's really, really worth a watch. I will just finish though by talking about the first shot of the film, which we'll put on screen now. It's just such a poignant shot and a great way to start the film. It begins on this vast green landscape that I talked about earlier and is so common in New Zealand. But this movie isn't set in those landscapes. The shot zooms out to show that this was all on a billboard, to show the true location of this film, an industrial city filled with concrete. It's exactly what this film is trying to depict, right? How a culture adapts from being warriors looking over their vast land to living in an industrial city, from green to grey. All right, that's all 5 movies talked about. Now to the part you probably skipped to, the most exciting part of the episode. It's the rankings, the world rankings, the Cinema Olympics. New Zealand gets a 6.6. And that puts it in 3rd place on the world ranking list. Wow, just behind Uruguay there. The race is really heating up, isn't it, folks? So stay tuned for our next episode. Please put your suggestions in the comments below. We've been getting quite a few. We're really excited to do some of these. They do take a while to make, so I'm sorry if we don't get to it straight away, but they are in the pipeline. Stay tuned and bye.